Macs don't run Windows. That's what most people assume, and technically, they're right. macOS and Windows are completely different operating systems, built on different foundations, designed by different companies. They're not supposed to coexist on the same machine. And yet, millions of people run Windows on their Macs every single day. Not by replacing macOS, not by rebooting into a different system. They run both at the same time on the same hardware, as if this contradiction doesn't exist. Same machine. Two operating systems, running side by side like it's the most natural thing in the world. This is made possible by virtualization and tools like Parallels that turn that idea into something people can actually use. So how is that possible? How do you take two incompatible systems and make them work together without breaking either one? And more importantly, why did figuring this out change the way people think about using Macs in the first place? This video explains exactly how Windows runs on a Mac. Not the marketing version, the actual mechanics. What makes it work, what had to change, and why it matters more than you'd think. To understand how Windows runs on a Mac, you first need to understand what doesn't work. For most of computing history, one machine meant one operating system. You bought a Mac, you got macOS. You bought a PC, you got Windows. The two didn't mix, and they weren't designed to. This wasn't just a branding issue. macOS and Windows are fundamentally different. They handle hardware differently. They organize files differently. They expect different instructions from the processor. You can't just drop Windows onto a Mac and expect it to understand what's happening. So for years, if you needed both systems, you had two terrible options. You could restart your Mac every time you wanted to switch between macOS and Windows, which meant installing both systems on separate partitions and choosing one at boot. Or you could just accept that you'd never have access to both at the same time. Either way, you lost something. If you were working in macOS and suddenly needed a Windows-only app, you had to stop everything, reboot, wait, and start over in a completely different environment. Your macOS apps were gone. Your open files were inaccessible. Your entire workflow just evaporated. And if you decided to stay in Windows, you gave up all the macOS features you probably bought the Mac for in the first place. No continuity with your iPhone. No macOS specific software. You were just using a Mac as an expensive Windows machine. The cost wasn't just inconvenience, it was time. It was broken workflows. It was constant friction between two systems that refused to cooperate. For years, running Windows on a Mac meant choosing one world and leaving the other behind. The solution to this problem is called virtualization. And before you assume this is some technical workaround that barely functions, let me be clear. Virtualization is not emulation. It's not pretending. It's not tricking the system into thinking it's something else. Virtualization means running a real operating system, using real hardware, without replacing the operating system that's already there. Here's the idea. You have one physical machine, one set of processors, one amount of memory, one graphics card, one storage drive. That hardware doesn't change. But instead of dedicating all of it to a single operating system, you divide it intelligently. You let macOS control the Mac like it always has, and then you create a separate, isolated environment where Windows can run, using a portion of that same hardware. Windows isn't replacing macOS, it's running inside it. Think of it like this. macOS is the foundation. It's still managing the hardware, still handling the core system functions. But within macOS, you create a contained space where Windows operates as if it's on its own machine. Windows gets access to the processor, it gets memory, it gets storage, but it's all controlled and allocated by macOS in the background. The two systems are completely separate. Windows can't interfere with macOS. macOS can't accidentally overwrite Windows. They share the same physical machine, but they don't touch each other's files, settings, or processes. That separation is what makes this safe. That isolation is what makes it stable. Virtualization made this possible in theory, but theory alone isn't enough. Virtualization is the concept. Parallels is the software that makes it actually work on a Mac. Because here's the thing, the idea of running multiple operating systems on one machine has been around for decades, but making it smooth, stable, and usable requires software that's specifically built for that purpose. You need something that can manage the hardware allocation, handle the separation between systems, and make Windows behave like it belongs on a Mac in the first place. That's what Parallels does. It's virtualization software designed specifically for macOS. It creates the environment where Windows can run, manages the resources Windows needs, and makes sure both systems can operate without conflict. What this means in practice is straightforward. You open Parallels on your Mac, and Windows runs in a window, just like any other Mac application. You're not rebooting. You're not switching machines. You're not losing access to macOS. Windows is just there, running alongside everything else. And it's not isolated in a way that makes it useless. Windows apps behave like Mac apps. You can drag files between macOS and Windows. You can copy text in one system and paste it in the other. The clipboard works across both. The file system is shared where it needs to be. Windows doesn't feel like a separate computer. It feels like an extension of the Mac you're already using. This is what separates functional virtualization from theoretical virtualization. Parallels handles the complexity, so you don't have to think about it. Parallels is what turns virtualization from a technical concept into something people actually use every day. This sounds obvious now, but at the time, this completely flipped how people thought about Macs. Before virtualization became practical, owning a Mac came with an implicit limitation. There were things you just couldn't do. Certain apps only existed on Windows. Certain workflows required Windows-specific software. And if you needed those things, you either bought a second computer or you didn't buy a Mac at all. Virtualization removed that limitation, and when it did, it changed what a Mac could be. Suddenly, a Mac wasn't a machine that locked you into one ecosystem. It was a machine that could access both. You could run macOS for everything it does well, and the moment you needed a Windows-only app, you could open it without leaving macOS behind. One device, multiple ecosystems, no compromises. This mattered for specific groups of people more than others. Developers who needed to test software on both macOS and Windows could do it on one machine instead of switching between two. Students who needed Windows for one class but preferred macOS for everything else didn't have to choose anymore. Professionals who relied on a single Windows-only app but wanted to use a Mac for everything else finally had a way to make that work. The workflow gain was significant. No second computer taking up desk space. No context switching between two different machines. No mental overhead of remembering which system had which file. Everything existed in one place, accessible at the same time, without rebooting or compromising either side. And this didn't just solve a technical problem, it changed the perception of what Macs were capable of. They stopped being seen as limited machines that only worked within Apple's ecosystem. They became flexible platforms that could adapt to whatever software someone actually needed to use. Virtualization didn't just solve a technical problem, it changed how people think about what a Mac can be. Then Apple changed the processor architecture. In 2020, Apple started moving Macs away from Intel processors to their own custom-designed chips, called Apple Silicon. And when that happened, a lot of people assumed virtualization would break. Because here's why that assumption made sense. Intel processors and Apple Silicon work differently. They use different instruction sets. Software written for one doesn't automatically work on the other. Windows itself was built primarily for Intel-based machines, so when Mac switched to a completely different architecture, it seemed reasonable to think that running Windows on a Mac would become impossible, or at least significantly worse. That didn't happen. Virtualization didn't disappear, it evolved. Parallels adapted. The software was rebuilt to work natively on Apple Silicon, and because Apple's chips are more efficient and more powerful than the Intel processors they replaced, virtualization on modern Macs actually performs better than it did before. Windows runs faster, it uses less power. The experience improved, not in spite of the architecture change, but because of it. There's a caveat here. The version of Windows that runs on Apple Silicon Macs is Windows on ARM, not the traditional Intel-based version. But for most use cases, this distinction doesn't matter. The apps people need still work, the workflows still function, and Parallels integrates deeply with the system layers that make this experience feel seamless for most everyday workflows. What this means is that virtualization didn't become obsolete when Apple Silicon arrived. It became optimized for a new generation of hardware. This is why running Windows on a Mac today feels very different from how it used to. If you've ever been in a situation where you needed one specific Windows app but didn't want to give up macOS, this is exactly the kind of problem Parallels was designed to solve. It's not about abandoning one system for another. It's about removing the need to choose in the first place. You use the operating system that works best for what you're doing, and when you need the other one, it's already there. No second machine, no rebooting, no workflow interruption. That's the core value, and it's why virtualization software like Parallels exists at all. The broader takeaway here isn't just about Macs and Windows. It's about what happens when operating system boundaries stop being barriers. For decades, the choice of hardware determined the choice of software. If you bought a Mac, you were locked into macOS and whatever apps existed for it. If you bought a Windows PC, you were locked into that ecosystem instead. The machine you owned dictated the tools you could use. Virtualization broke that connection. It made the operating system a layer you could access on demand, rather than a permanent limitation. And when that happened, the emphasis shifted. Hardware became less about which ecosystem it belonged to, and more about which machine had the performance, design, or features you actually wanted. Macs stopped being Mac-only machines. They became flexible computing platforms where the operating system was just one part of the equation, not the defining constraint. This matters because it changes how people make decisions about what computer to buy. You don't have to ask yourself whether you're willing to give up Windows apps to use a Mac. You don't have to compromise. You can prioritize the hardware you prefer and still have access to the software you need, regardless of which operating system it was built for. Virtualization quietly removed one of the biggest barriers in personal computing, and most people don't even realize it happened. This video is made in partnership with Parallels. They're the ones who built the software that makes all of this possible, and they're the reason virtualization on macOS works as smoothly as it does. If you've been considering running Windows on your Mac, or if you've been avoiding buying a Mac specifically because you need access to Windows software, Parallels is currently offering up to 45% off, depending on the edition you choose. If you want to see how this works on your own Mac, I'll leave the link in the description. Now you know how Windows actually runs on a Mac.